Imagine a tiny baby wrapped in tattered cloth placed quietly under a tree in the middle of the forest. On a dark, starless night, he cried quietly alone, without knowing who he was, without knowing why the world had rejected him since birth. In the distance, a poor farmer heard the cries, and his footsteps that day changed the fate of an orphan who turned out to be the grandson of a billionaire who had been searching for him for 10 years. What really happened behind the dumping? But before we start the story, don't forget to support us by liking, commenting, and subscribing to this channel so that we are always enthusiastic about sharing other interesting stories. For those who like, comment, and subscribe to this channel, we pray that all their affairs will be made easier, their sustenance will be expanded, their bodies will be healthy, and all their wishes will be granted in the afterlife. Let's start the story. The sky that afternoon looked gloomy, as if feeling the fatigue of an old man who was walking unsteadily among the bushes and tree roots. His name is Mr. Jono. His body was thin, his face was covered in deep wrinkles, and his old hands were holding a machete that was starting to become blunt. Every day he walks through the small forest on the outskirts of his village to collect dry twigs, hoping to sell them at the market the next morning. That day, the sky looked grayer than usual. The wind blew gently, carrying the scent of wet earth and the light rain that was starting to fall slowly. Mr. Jono still hasn't found enough wood. His steps were slow, stumbling over dry roots and leaves, but he continued walking with his enthusiasm still burning. In his old age, he had only one reason to survive: his wife, Mrs. Mina. Suddenly he stopped walking. A soft voice could be heard faintly from behind the bushes. It wasn't an animal's voice, nor was it an adult's voice. It was the sound of a baby crying. A weak cry, almost broken, but clear enough to Mr. Jono's ears, who was starting to age. Holding his breath, he slowly walked towards the sound. His heart was beating fast. Fear and curiosity were wrestling in his mind. As he opened the thick bush, his eyes widened. Under the big tree, slightly sheltered from the drizzle, there was a bundle of shabby blankets. Inside, a baby boy with a red face and a body that was starting to turn blue from the cold. The cry sounded weak. The baby looked at him with wet eyes, as if asking for help. Beside the tiny body lay a piece of paper. His trembling hands took it. The handwriting there was shaky, as if it was written in a panic. "Forgive me. Protect him." Mr. Jono stood frozen. The world felt silent. He looked at the baby, and for some reason his tears started to fall. He knew what to do, but his mind was full of questions. Who abandoned this baby? Why in a place like this? And why him? He knew his life was already difficult. He wasn't even sure he could feed his own wife tonight. But if he left this child in the forest, only death awaited him. He couldn't do it. Slowly, he lifted the small body into his arms. The baby groaned softly. Her hands gripped Mr. Jono's shirt. Sola knew that she had found a safe place. Mr. Jono's steps were heavy as he walked home. The cold wind began to blow and the rain became heavier. But he kept walking, wrapping the baby in his thin jacket. On the way, he looked up at the sky and whispered softly, "God, I don't know who he is. But if this is a test from Musarkan." When he got home, Bua was shocked. His body was weak due to age and frequent illnesses. But when she saw her husband carrying a baby, her eyes immediately widened. He didn't ask anything. He just looked at the baby's face and cried. For years she had prayed to have children. For years he endured the pain because his prayers were never answered. Mr. Jono put the baby in his wife's arms. They sat together on the dirt floor. In a meaningful silence, the baby fell asleep slowly in Bumina's arms. It was as if Ing had rediscovered the womb that once contained her. That night they agreed to take care of the baby. They gave him the name Bayu, a simple name but full of hope. The hope that his life will be better in the future, that he will grow up to be a strong child. Despite being born in the most tragic circumstances, the years passed. Bayu grew up in simplicity. Their house has bamboo walls leaking here and there. Sometimes he only eats rice and salt, but Bayu never complains. He grew up to be a sweet child, full of smiles, and loved his adoptive parents very much. He helped Mr. Jono in the fields, carrying buckets of water, planting seeds, and even learning to herd the neighbors' goats. Mrs. Mina always said that Bayu was a gift from Allah sent at the time they needed him most. Even though his illness never got better, he always felt strong when he saw Bayu playing and laughing. However, one thing they always hid from Bayu was his origins. The small letter that was left with him was kept tightly in a wooden box under the bed. Mr. Jono has never read the contents of the letter to anyone. In her heart she wants Bayu to grow up without burdens, without past wounds, but life cannot be hidden forever. At every step Bayu takes, there are questions waiting for their time to rise. Who is he really? Why was he abandoned? And who wrote the apology letter? Those questions will be the seeds of the storm to come. A storm that will shake their entire lives. And everything will start from here. From a small cry that was heard in the middle of the silent forest. 5 years have passed since the sound of crying in the forest changed the lives of Pak Jono and Bamina forever. Bayu has now grown into a smart, cheerful little boy. And full of curiosity. He is only 5 years old, but he is already used to living in the harsh reality. Every morning when the other children are still asleep, Bayu is already awake, helping Mrs. Mina prepare hot water and sweep the yard. Even though his body is small, his hands are agile. He learned from seeing, not from books or school. He learned how to live from 2 adoptive parents who struggled with poverty every day. Mr. Jono often takes Bayu to the fields. The small field does not belong to them. They are just laborers, working at the mercy of the landowner who allowed them to take part of the harvest as wages. When the sun was scorching and the ground was cracking due to the long drought, Bayu didn't complain. He kept smiling, holding a small hoe that Mr. Jono had specially made from old pieces of wood. Amidst all these limitations, love is the only thing that is never lacking. Mr. Jono always strokes Bayu's head before going to sleep. Meanwhile, Mrs. Mina, with a hoarse voice and a body that was starting to weaken, continued to sing the Nina Bobo song with a tone that never changed. But not everyone in the village views the family with respect. Some neighbors started whispering. They questioned Bayu's origins, looking at him with strange looks. It was as if the child was carrying a curse or burden that would one day explode. Little Bayu often saw how his mother looked down when passing those houses. He didn't understand yet, but he could feel the hurt hidden behind his mother's smile. One evening after working all day in the fields, Mr. Jono and Bayu sat in front of the house. They looked up at the sky. The stars looked brighter that night. Bayu asked quietly, "Sir, why do people sometimes look at me strangely?" Mr. Jono was silent. He didn't want to answer, but he knew such a question would come one day. He looked at the child's face. A face he had never forgotten since he first found it. A face that always reminded him of the promise he made in the middle of the forest to Allah. "Because you're special, you," she finally answered. "People are sometimes afraid of things they don't understand." Bayu didn't ask again that night, but in his heart, curiosity grew. He knew he was different. He knew the blood flowing in his body wasn't Mr. Jono's and Mrs. Mina's. But every time he thought about it, He always remembered how warm his adoptive mother's embrace was, and how hard his adoptive father's hands worked for a plate of rice on the table. Years passed. Bayu was now 10 years old. He never went to school, but he could read, write, and count. He learned from used books that Mrs. Mina collected from the flea market. He studied secretly, at night under the dim light of an oil lamp. He didn't want his parents to know because he didn't want them to feel guilty about not being able to send him to school. Bayu's only dream at that time was very simple: to make Mrs. Mina get better. His adoptive mother was getting weaker day by day. Her cough was getting worse, her body was getting thinner. But she still smiled, still hugged Bayu every night, and still said that everything would be okay. Bayu knew it was a lie, but he also knew his mother was lying, 'cause he loved them. And he repaid the lie with a silent promise that one day he would make them happy. But life isn't a fairy tale. No miracle comes without first suffering. And that night, Bayu witnessed for the first time how his mother collapsed in the kitchen, coughing up blood, and didn't wake up for several minutes. Mr. Jono panicked. He carried his wife and ran to a neighbor's house with an old motorbike. They took Mrs. Mina to the village clinic. But the doctor could only prescribe generic medication and suggested taking her to the city hospital. Advice that sounded like a bitter joke to a family that still had to borrow money to eat. Bayu sat outside the clinic, clutching his knees, holding back tears. The world he had always thought small and safe now felt so big and cruel. He knew that if there wasn't a miracle, the person he loved most in this world would be gone and he couldn't do anything. That night, in the silence and cold wind, Bayu prayed. His hands trembled, his voice saying, "God, if you really want to get well, just take my life. Don't take her." The prayer of a child who doesn't know that life doesn't always listen. And when morning came, Bayu's life began to change. Shifted in a direction he never imagined. Not because his mother was cured, but because a stranger arrived in the village in a luxury car and stared at Bayu with suspicious eyes. Eyes that seemed to say, "I know who you really are." That morning, Pak Jono's house was much quieter than usual. Bayu woke up earlier than usual, but didn't hear Bumina's weak cough or his adoptive father's footsteps in the yard. He opened his parents' bedroom door and found his mother still lying there. Her face was pale, her breath as soft as the wind. Bayu immediately called for his father. Pak Jono rushed in. He placed a hand on his wife's forehead and sighed heavily. It was hot. Her fever was getting higher. They didn't have enough money for medicine. The remaining money from yesterday's harvest wasn't even enough to buy half a packet of rice. That day, Bayu didn't accompany his father to the fields. He stayed at home, waiting for his mother, changing the warm compress, and occasionally giving her a drink of the guava leaf decoction his neighbor had taught him. Every time his mother opened her eyes, she smiled and touched Bayu's face with trembling hands. But her smile wasn't as bright as before. Strong, okay, son," she said hoarsely. Bayu just nodded. He swallowed all his tears into his chest. He knew his mother was saying goodbye, but he couldn't let that happen. Not now. When night fell and Mrs. Mina fell asleep from exhaustion, Bayu sat outside the house. He looked up at the sky, but there were no stars that night. Only the dark sky and the wind that pierced his skin. In his heart, he prayed to God again, asking that his mother be given another day, another week. Enough time so he could earn money. Whatever the way, the next morning, Bayu dared to go to the market. He brought a bunch of bananas from the backyard, peddling them from one stall to another. But no one bought them. The bananas were too small, not worth selling in their eyes. Some just looked at him with pity, gave him stale bread, then told him to go home. In the middle of the market, Bayu heard the unusual sound of a car horn. A large black car stopped at the side of the road. The back door opened and an elderly woman in elegant clothes got out. Her hair was neatly tied up and sunglasses were on her face. A man dressed as a driver helped her out. People immediately whispered, "Who is that? Why did she come to the village market?" Bayu didn't care. He continued selling his bananas, now walking along the vegetable stalls at the end of the market. But he stopped when the old woman stared at him intently. Her eyes were sharp, full of wonder, as if she were searching for something. The woman called her driver and said something in a low voice. Then she walked over to Bayu. "Son, what's your name?" she asked in a soft but authoritative voice. Bayu hesitated. He had never been asked this by a stranger before. "Bayu, ma'am," he answered softly. The woman smiled, but her smile wasn't entirely sincere. "Where do you live?" Bayu pointed east. "At the end of the village, a bamboo house near a large mango tree." The woman seemed thoughtful. Her eyes stared deeply into Bayu's face. Then she called her driver and whispered again. A short time later they got back into the car and drove off. Bayu just stood there, confused. He didn't know who the woman was, but there was something in her eyes that made him feel like he was seen as something more than just a poor farmer's son. As if he was seen as something lost. A few days later, Ma'am Mina fainted again. This time for longer. Mr. Jono panicked and took his wife to the nearest community health center. The doctor said in a low voice that Mrs. Mina's condition was deteriorating drastically. Her lungs were weakening. If she wasn't taken to a major hospital immediately, her life could be in danger. But where would the money come from? Hope was her only breath. Bayu sat beside his mother's bed, holding her cold, wizened hand, which no longer had any strength. Mr. Jono could only stare at the floor, his face covered in wounds that words couldn't describe. Suddenly, the community health center door opened. An old woman from the market entered, followed by her driver. She looked at Bayu, then at Mrs. Mina, and finally at Mr. Jono. "I want to talk to you," she said briefly. Mr. Jono nodded, and they went out into the yard for a moment. Bayu remained inside, confused, afraid, and curious. Outside, the woman introduced herself as Mrs. Rekna. She said she had been looking for her lost grandchild for a long time. She showed him a photo of her daughter, then a photo of a baby. "I know this is crazy, sir. But your child's face looks exactly like my daughter who died after giving birth. I just want to know." Mr. Jono was silent. She had never told anyone about Bayu's origins. Even Mrs. Mina didn't know what the letter she had found contained. But now everything seemed to be slowly unraveling, and her fear began to rise. Was this woman going to take Bayu from her? "What does she want from us?" Mr. Jono asked. "In the end, I just want to know the truth. If he is my grandson, I will help him. Help your wife. Have money. I can take him to the best hospital." Mrs. Ratna said, her voice trembling. The words were like a slap. Mr. Jono knew he couldn't refuse. This was a matter of his wife's life and death. "Then help us. But don't hurt my son. He is my son. Found him. I raised him." Mr. Jono's voice cracked. Ratna nodded slowly. "Understand. I won't take him. I just want to help." That same day, Mrs. Mina was taken to a large hospital in the city. For the first time in his life, Bayu saw a tall building with bright lights and clean beds. He also saw his mother being cared for by polite doctors and nurses. It wasn't just being given generic medicine, but all the miracles came with a slowly creeping realization into his life. That there was a past that would soon be revealed. A past that might destroy everything he had considered home. Bayu stood frozen in the hospital corridor. Around him, people walked by in white uniforms, carrying medical equipment, pushing patient beds, or speaking with solemn faces. But what stuck in his memory was the look in the old woman's eyes. Mrs. Ratna, who seemed to know something he didn't know about himself. Several days had passed since Mrs. Ekna's arrival. Mrs. Mina was still in intensive care. Sometimes conscious, sometimes asleep. Her body was weak, and her breathing was still assisted by a machine. But for the first time they could hope a little. All the hospital expenses were covered by the woman. Even a private nurse was sent to help. Mr. Jono still had doubts. He couldn't hate the woman who had saved his wife's life. But there was a growing sense of unease. He felt like he was missing something. Bayu began to feel something had changed. The hospital was too luxurious for him. The clothes Mrs. Ratna had lent him were too soft, too clean. He felt like a doll transported from his old world to a strange, enigmatic one. One morning Mrs. Ratna came to the hospital with she brought something that made time seem to stop. Small old silver box. She told Mr. Jono and Bayu to sit down. Then she slowly opened the box and took out an old photograph. In it was a young woman holding a baby boy. Behind her was a large house with a spacious yard. "This is my son," Ratty said quietly. And the baby she was holding was my grandson. Bayu stared at the photo closely. The baby's face was like a small mirror from the past. Even the shape of his ears was the same. He felt strange. His chest tightened. He didn't understand why his heart was beating so hard. Ratna took a deep breath. "My daughter fell in love with a poor man. We didn't agree. She ran away from home and we lost track of her. A few months later, we heard she died in a childbirth accident. But the baby disappeared and was never found." She looked at Mr. Jono with teary eyes. "Maybe Bayu is my grandson." Mr. Jono looked down. He took out a worn piece of paper. The paper he had hidden under the bed of his bamboo house. The paper he had found with the baby in the forest. He handed it to Mrs. Ratna, didn't say a word. The old woman read it. Her hands were shaking. "This is Ratia's handwriting. I know the curved R's like this by heart. This is my son's last letter." She burst into tears. Not loud tears, but tears that had been held back for so long that her body shook. The driver looked at her worriedly, but didn't dare speak. Mr. Jono could only stare at the floor. Meanwhile, Bayu didn't know what to feel. Happy, scared, confused. He was only 10 years old. But suddenly the world had placed a huge burden on his shoulders. The following days passed in tension. Ratna secretly requested a DNA test. She asked permission to take Bayu to the city for a medical checkup. Mr. Jono, though reluctant, agreed because the entire process was carried out politely and respectfully. The test was conducted in a modern laboratory that Bayu had never imagined. The place, with its gleaming white walls, smelled of alcohol and the sound of machines humming softly. He just sat, gave a saliva sample, and signed a few sheets of paper whose contents he didn't understand. Once finished, they returned to the hospital. The days passed slowly. Bayu continued to look after his mother, but his mind kept wandering. Who was he really? Was he really the grandson of that rich woman? If so, what about Mr. Jono and Mrs. Mina? Did all this mean he had to leave them? Finally the test results came. Mr. Jono sat next to Mrs. Ratna. Rekna the driver and a man in a suit who turned out to be the family lawyer were also present. The test results document was opened. The atmosphere became silent. Only the ticking of the wall clock could be heard. Positive, the man said. Bayu was Mrs. Ratna's biological grandson. No one said a word. Bayu stared at Mr. Jono's face, looking for a reaction. But the old man only nodded slowly, as if he had known all along. He held Bayu's hand and said in a trembling voice, "You are still my son, you. It doesn't matter whose blood you come from." That sentence hit Bayu's heart harder than any news. He cried, hugged his adoptive father tightly and said, "I don't want to go, sir. I want to stay at our house." Ratna wasn't angry. Instead, she lowered her head, holding back tears. "I won't force you, son. But let me be close to you. I've lost your mother. I don't want to lose you too." That night, Bayu couldn't sleep. He sat beside his mother, holding her weak hand. He didn't know what would happen tomorrow. But what was certain was that his life had changed, and the world that had once been narrow and simple was now wide open, full of secrets and full of difficult choices that he had to face. Since the DNA test results came out, Bayu's life had changed slowly. He still lived in the hospital with Mrs. Mina, whose condition was starting to improve. But now he had more visitors. Ratna came almost every day bringing food, clean clothes, even toys and storybooks. But unlike usual, Bayu didn't immediately greet all of them with a smile. There was doubt growing inside him. On the one hand, he knew the old woman loved him. But on the other hand, he also knew Mrs. Ratna's presence. Ratna brought a new world that was slowly distancing him from his adoptive parents. One afternoon when Mrs. Ratna was sitting on a bench in the hospital garden with Bayu, he took out an old photo album. It was dusty and a little worn, but when opened, it contained pages of the past that seemed to come to life. "This was our family home," said Mrs. Ratna, pointing to a large building with a neat garden. "And this is your mother, Ratty. She's beautiful, isn't she?" Bayu nodded slowly. He didn't know what to say. The woman in the photo was indeed beautiful. She looked too much like him. Even her smile looked like a mirror. "Your father was a simple young man," he continued. "Mrs. Ratna worked as a driver in our family company. But your mother loved him sincerely. We refused. Of course, we said love isn't enough without status and wealth." Mrs. Ratna's voice trembled, her eyes starting to well up with tears. "And it turns out we were the ones who were wrong." Bayu lowered his head. His heart began to rebel. He wanted to know more, but he was also afraid. He wanted to know why he was dumped, but he was also afraid that the truth would be too painful. They ran away, married secretly, and never returned. Mrs. Ratna continued. "We searched everywhere until we heard the sad news from a hospital in a small town. Your mother died after giving birth, but the baby was gone." Bayu gripped the edge of the garden chair. He stared at the grass beneath his feet. "Why was I left in the forest?" he whispered softly. Ratna paused, then shook her head slowly. "We don't know. But that letter might have been written in her last moments. Maybe your mother entrusted you to someone she trusted. Maybe she couldn't take it anymore. We can only guess." Bayu stood staring at the sky, which was starting to turn orange. He felt empty, as if he had just read the first chapter of his life story, which had been kept hidden for so long. In the following days, Mrs. Ratna began to frequently bring Bayu to her large house in the city for lunch, or to play in the garden. The house was grand but quiet. There was no laughter from children, no sounds of cooking from the kitchen, only the chime of the old clock and the hum of the air conditioner. Every time Bayu came, he was greeted warmly. But he knew not everyone in the house welcomed him sincerely. There was one man, Uncle Reza, Tarinian Ratna's son, who always looked at Bayu cynically. He said nothing, but his eyes clearly held rejection. To Reza, Bayu was a threat. A village boy who suddenly appears and has the potential to seize the inheritance he has been eyeing. One night, Bayu is playing a puzzle in the living room when he hears a conversation coming from behind the wall. Mrs. Ratna's voice sounds weak. "Reza, he's my grandson. I just want to get to know him better." Then Reza's voice was loud and full of anger. "But why did you have to bring him here? He's a nobody. That kid only brings trouble. What if people find out? What's the harm in people knowing? He's our family." "He's not my family." Bayu bit his lip. His hands were shaking. The puzzle in front of him fell apart. That night he couldn't sleep. He looked at the sky from the large living room window. He felt like a stranger, like an uninvited guest in a house that he said belonged to him too. But why does everything feel so far away? The next day he asked to go home to the hospital. Yes, Ratna didn't refuse, but her face looked disappointed. He knew his heart could not be forced. Child needs time. But time went on and Mrs. Mina's condition started to worsen again. On the other hand, pressure from the family began to be felt. Some of Mrs. Ratna's relatives began to question her decision. They accused him of bringing a wild child into the family line, risking his reputation for something that wasn't necessarily true. Yes, Ratna stands alone in the midst of an inner battle. On the one hand, he wants to protect Bayu. But on the other hand, he knew their world was too cruel for such an innocent child. He knew that whatever decision he made there would be a price to pay. And that night as Bayu slept beside Buminua's bed, Mrs. Ratna stood outside the hospital room, looking up at the bright city sky. In his hands, he held a photo of little Rati and Bayu. "I'll take care of you, son. But are you ready to face all this?" It has been 2 weeks since Bayu found out that he is not the biological child of Mr. Jono and Mrs. Mina. But that reality did not make his heart turn away. Every morning he still wakes up in the hospital, wiping Mrs. Mina's increasingly pale forehead, reading a storybook while holding her hand. He doesn't care who his real parents are. What he knows is that true love is not determined by blood, but by who sacrifices everything for your happiness. However, the world out there thinks differently. The media began to pick up on the news that the long-lost grandson of a billionaire had been living as the son of a poor farmer. Several journalists tried to approach the hospital. Photos of Mrs. Ratna with Bayu were spread on the internet. All eyes were now on the little boy who was just figuring out who he was. Yes, Ratna tries to protect Bayu as best she can. He hired lawyers, installed security, and even bribed journalists to protect Bayu's privacy. But the rumors had spread and the enemy had begun to move. Uncle Reza, who had been holding a grudge in silence, began to make plans. He contacted some of the family's old lawyers, reopening the company's inheritance and asset structure. And in front of several relatives he said firmly, "If Bayu is legally recognized as the heir, then our rights will be reduced. He must be removed at all costs." Meanwhile, Mr. Jono, who had been silent all this time, began to feel restless. He felt he had brought Bayu into a world that was not his own. A world full of intrigue. But he also knew to refuse Madam Ratna is not an option. He saved Bumina's life. And even though the fear continued to haunt him, he knew that now he had to protect Bayu in a different way. One night, when the hospital was quiet and the night breeze was flowing through the window, Bayu heard a loud noise from outside the room. He peeked in and saw 2 unknown men talking to the nurse at the reception. Their faces were suspicious. Their body movements were aggressive. Then they looked at him. Bayu panicked. He closed the door slowly and ran towards Mr. Jono, who was asleep on a wooden bench. He shook his adoptive father's body with trembling hands. "Sir, there is a strange person." Mr. Jono immediately became alert. As a protector appears instantly. He stood peering from behind the curtain. When he confirmed that the two men were trying to ask the nurse about Bayou, he immediately took quick action. He carried Bayou, covered his face with a blanket and slipped out through the back door of the hospital. In the dark of night and the dim light of street lamps, they walked along the narrow alley behind the hospital. Their steps were slow but sure. Mr. Jono knows the area. He used to work in an old building not far from there. They hid overnight in an abandoned warehouse. Bayou curled up in his father's arms. Her body was shaking, but her eyes did not shed tears. He was too shocked, too confused. He didn't know who was chasing him or why. In the morning Mrs. Ratna found them. He came with a panicked face followed by two personal bodyguards. He hugged Bayou tightly, then looked at Mr. Jono with red eyes. "Forgive me. I trust everyone too much. I didn't know Reza would do this." Mr. Jono didn't answer. He just hugged Bayou tighter. After the incident, Bayou was moved to a safe house on the outskirts of the city. Small house but quiet and safe. Yes, Ratna also began preparing the legal process to legally appoint Bayou as her legal heir and grandson. But the move was not without consequences. Reza filed a lawsuit. He accused Bayou of being a fake child who was only used by poor people to rob the family of their wealth. He presented false witnesses, spread lies, and even sent threatening letters to Mrs. The media community is in an uproar again. Bayou's name appears in various news. But Bayou at a young age began to learn about a world full of falsehood. He no longer cries when he is slandered. He just hugged Bumina, who was now being cared for in the small house with the help of a private nurse. He knows that as long as he is with the person he loves, he will not waver. Yes, Ratna tries to talk to Reza, but Reza refuses. He even said openly, "If Bayou stays here, I will consider him an enemy and I don't care who protects him." Yes, Ratna finally made a big decision. He gathered all the family, lawyers and journalists. In front of them all, he stood up straight and said, "Bayou is my biological grandson, and from today on I will protect him as I protect my daughter Rati. None of you can shake this decision." But the threats did not stop. One night, the small house where Bayou lived was terrorized. The windows were smashed. Threatening letters were thrown inside. The contents were short but sharp. "Get out of this family's life or be prepared to lose everything." Mr. Jono could not stand it anymore. He cried in his room, sitting kneeling in front of the bed, where Mrs. Mina slept weakly. "I just want Bayou to live in peace. Why did all this have to happen, Min?" Bayou, who heard that from behind the door, clutched his knees. For the first time in his life he felt angry. He didn't just want to survive, he wanted to fight. He wanted to prove that he was not a child who could be scared. And that night he began to write all his stories in an old notebook. About the forest, about crying under a tree, about parental love that is not from blood, and about a world that is not always fair. He wanted the world to know who he really was. The days in the small house where Bayou lived began to change drastically. It wasn't the sound of crickets or the night breeze that could be heard anymore, but the loud knocking of uninvited guests, cameras peeking out from behind bushes, and even black cars parked across the street every night. Bayou felt like his life wasn't his anymore. He'd become the center of attention, not because of his achievements, but because of a bloodline that suddenly emerged from the darkness. He never asked to be born of billionaire blood. He never asked for inheritance, power, or luxury. He just wanted his mother to get well, his father to rest, and their lives to go back to the way they had been. However, everything had changed and would never go back to the way they were. The legal process to have Bayu recognized as his Sonyonya Ratna's grandson began. Lawyers accompanied him. Documents were submitted to the court, and witnesses were gathered. Ratna insisted that she wanted Bayu officially recognized with their extended family name listed after his. But Reza wouldn't stay silent. He began sending paid lawyers to oppose the process. He dug up the pasts of Mr. Jono and Mrs. Mina, looking for flaws, spreading rumors that they were in cahoots with Mrs. Ratna for wealth. Some media outlets even carried the hurtful headline, "From rice fields to the palace, the story of a farmer's son eyeing $1 trillion inheritance." Bayu read the news silently. He couldn't sleep that night. He felt like he'd been stripped naked before the world. He didn't yet understand what trillions of rupiah meant. All he knew was that the accusation insulted the two most precious people in his life. Mr. Jono reassured Bayu, but he was tired too. His body was starting to weaken, his heart was torn. He knew this wasn't about the child he found in the forest anymore. It was about power, pride, and unfinished business from the past. Meanwhile, Buminua's condition fluctuated, sometimes conscious, sometimes delirious. In the midst of her trances, she held Bayu's hand and whispered, "Never forget who you are, you. Wealth can be lost, but the love you have is what is precious." That sentence stuck in Bayu's heart. He wrote it on the first page of his notebook. A few days later, Bayu was summoned to court to testify. He sat on a long wooden bench surrounded by judges, lawyers, and television cameras. In front of him sat Reza with a cold smile. Beside him, his lawyer prepared files to challenge the validity of Bayu's identity. "What is your full name?" asked the judge. Bayu stared straight ahead. "Bayu, no surname." Bayu shook his head. "Then how are you sure you are Mrs. Ratna's grandson?" Bayu took a deep breath. "I wasn't sure before, but I know one thing. My parents are Mr. Jono and Mrs. Mina. They were the ones who found me, they were the ones who took care of me when no one was around. But now I also know my biological mother is Rati, and I know Mrs. Ratna is not just my grandmother, but a caring person." The room was silent, some people bowed, some nodded slowly, but Reza laughed sarcastically. "One more thing, Your Honor," said Reza's lawyer. "We have evidence that Mr. Jono received some money from Mrs. Ratna. We suspect this is part of their agreement to fake Bayu's identity in order to get a share of the inheritance." Mr. Jono immediately stood up. "That is not true." Her voice was trembling. "The money was for my wife's hospital bills. I never asked Mrs. Ratna to offer it. I even refused." The judge asked for calm. But the room was already noisy. Bayu hugged his father, tried to calm down, but his heart was burning. This is no longer about name or inheritance. This is about the dignity of the people he loves. Outside the courtroom, the media swarmed. The microphone was pointed at Bayu's face. The camera flash was blinding, but he only said one sentence before getting into the car. "I never asked for an inheritance. I just want my family to be respected." The statement went viral. Many netizens started to support Bayu. The hashtag support Bayu is trending. His confession video was viewed millions of times, but Reza did not remain silent. He spread fake footage, manipulated photos of Mr. Jono with envelopes of money, created the opinion that all of this was a conspiracy. At its peak, Bayu and his family received a summons from the Child Protection Agency due to a report that Mr. Jono was exploiting Bayu economically. Bayu was accused of being used to gain public sympathy for money. That day, Mr. Jono fainted in front of the law office. His body couldn't bear the pressure. Bayu cried on the side of the road, holding his father's cold hand. The world is too cruel for them. In the hospital, Mrs. Ratna came in a hurry. He saw Bayu sobbing on the waiting chair. Without saying a word, he hugged the child for a long time. H seemed to channel his last strength. They can insult me, but they won't touch you again. Grandma promised. And that night Mrs. Ratna contacted all the journalists, all the investors, all the family members who had been silent all this time. He announced that starting that night all his personal shares would be transferred to Bayu's name. Not because of wealth but because he wants the world to know. Love, blood, and courage are greater than greed. The night after Mrs. Ratna's shocking announcement, the atmosphere changed drastically. The landline phone wouldn't stop ringing. Major media outlets began to crowd the streets. Several members of the extended family who had previously remained silent have now emerged demanding an explanation. But not because they care but because they are afraid. Fear of losing part of the inheritance that they have always considered their absolute property. In the small house where Bayu and Pak Jono live, the tension is getting more and more palpable. Bayu could barely sleep. He sat in the corner of the room, writing down recent events in his notebook, but his hands were shaking. Outside there were the sounds of footsteps, shadows of people passing by, and the vibrations of a car engine that had stopped for too long. All of this creates anxiety that cuts to the bone. One morning Mr. Jono found his fence scribbled on with red paint. Cheaters, liars. Nearby was a chicken carcass with fresh blood and a piece of paper with writing on it. Return the child or prepare to die poor. Mr. Jono quietly cleaned it before Bayu woke up. He didn't want the child to see the world's hatred that he had been hiding with a smile. But that morning Bayu saw it too. He didn't say anything, just sat on the bamboo chair with his head down. Fear was no longer a foreign thing to him. A few days later, shocking news appeared on national television. One station broadcast an exclusive investigation which stated that Mr. Jono had been involved in an agrarian fraud case in his youth. Accompanied by old photos, anonymous sources, and exaggerated speculation. Bayu watched the news from the hospital waiting room. He just stared at the screen without blinking, while his hands tightly gripped the back of the chair. On the other hand, Mr. Jono did not react. He just stood up and walked out slowly. The world seemed to be robbing him of his dignity layer by layer. Shortly after, the police came not to arrest, but to investigate. They brought an official letter from the city police stating that they needed to follow up on public reports regarding alleged exploitation and misuse of Bayu's identity by Jono's family. In the midst of this situation, Mrs. Mina, whose body was already weak, heard a commotion from the room. She tried to get up, forced herself to sit up and said hoarsely, "If you want to know who Bayu is, ask God. That child is not a fraud. He is a light sent when our lives were dark." The police bowed respectfully. They left without taking anyone, but leaving deep wounds and shame. Ratna came that night with an angry expression that Bayu had never seen before. She didn't speak to anyone for several minutes. She just stood in front of the house, staring at the graffiti on the wall, and then said softly, "They wanted to make us give up, but they forgot. My grandson is the son of a woman who never gave up on anything." She hugged Bayu and this time her hands were shaking. Bayu felt that his grandmother's strength was being tested. But he also knew this was not the time to back down. The next day, Mrs. Ratna made a bold move. She held a press conference in front of the house. Surrounded by dozens of journalists, she stood with Bayu and Mr. Jono. "I, Mrs. Ratna, declare personally and legally that Bayu is my legitimate grandson." He is the son of Ratty, my only daughter. And Mr. Jono, who has cared for him all this time, is not just an adoptive father, but a hero in my family. All the accusations directed at him are slander that we will fight legally. The video was broadcast live and watched by millions. Netizens began to speak out. Many began to investigate Reza's life and discovered that some of his assets were the result of misappropriation of funds from the family company. Reza was cornered, but he didn't stay silent. He tried another strategy. He approached Mrs. Mina quietly when the old woman was alone. With a sweet voice and a fake look, he tried to provoke her. "Aunt Mina, Mom, I just want this family to be okay. But Bayu, he's a city boy now. He'll forget about you. It's better if you tell him to leave so you can have peace again." Mrs. Mina stared at Reza for a long time and then smiled faintly. "Son, if you want to know who Bayu is, look at how he protects his family. You're just afraid of losing something you don't even have." Reza flinched. He was angry but speechless. He walked away quickly, but his heart was burning. He swore that if he couldn't get rid of Bayu legally, he would do it in a dirtier way. Amidst all this, Bayu continued to write. He began sharing his notes through social media. Stories about the forest, the sound of his foster mother's cries at night, and her foster mother's warm smile despite her frail body. The story spread quickly. People began to learn his story, began to understand who he really was. The world was slowly changing. But behind the scenes, a bigger storm was approaching. And this time it wasn't just his reputation that was at stake. It was the lives of his loved ones. Several weeks had passed since Mrs. Rekna's press conference. The outside world seemed to calm down a little. But inside the small house, the storm was still palpable. Mr. Jono was becoming more silent. His body began to hunch over more deeply. His breathing was heavy, and the white hair on his head seemed to have increased in just a matter of days. Bayu knew all this pressure was slowly eating away at his foster father. Although Mr. Jono never said it directly, his eyes held a heavy burden he had never shared. Bayu wanted to talk, but he didn't want to make things more difficult. He could only continue hugging his father every morning and night like he used to when he was little and didn't know who he was. Meanwhile, Mrs. Mina's condition was worsening. Her final days were filled with intensive medical care. Private nurses came and went, but nothing could replace her. The warmth of the hug and the soft prayer that Bumina used to whisper in Bayu's ear as he slept. One night, when the sound of crickets replaced Druwan, Bayu sat beside Mrs. Mina's bed. He held his mother's cold hand, staring at her wrinkled face as tears slowly fell. "Mom, Bayu doesn't want all this," he whispered. "Bayu doesn't need an inheritance. Bayu just wants us to be like before, even if we're poor, but together." Mrs. Mina smiled. A weak smile that seemed to understand all the burdens in the child's chest. He nodded slowly. "You know you. But sometimes life gives us things we don't ask for reasons we don't yet understand." That night, Mrs. Mina fell asleep silently. And the next morning she didn't wake up again. Bayu broke down crying in Mr. Jono's arms. There were no words to describe the loss. Bayu's world, once small and full of laughter, now felt vast and empty. He felt as if the only shelter that had saved him from the harshness of the world had been lost forever. The funeral was simple. Few neighbors came. Ratna hugged Bayu tightly, but she knew her embrace could not replace the loss. Reza wasn't present, but he secretly sent a large bouquet of flowers inscribed with Bayu's full name and family titles. Bayu threw the bouquet into the river. He didn't need recognition from the person who insulted his family. After the funeral, Bayu sat for a long time under the old mango tree in the yard, the place where he used to play with Bina, where he learned to sweep the yard and listen to simple stories from his mother. At that moment Mr. Jono approached. He sat next to Bayu quietly, his voice barely audible. If you want to go with Grandma, live in a big house, a good school, all the facilities, I won't stand you. Bayu shook his head. Bayu doesn't want to go anywhere, sir. Bayu wants to be here in our house with you. Mr. Jono hugged him gently but tightly. And in that embrace, Bayu knew he had made a decision. He wouldn't chase an inheritance. He wouldn't move to the palace. He would build a life in the place that had taught him the meaning of unconditional love. Bayu's decision shocked the media. He refused to live in Nyonya's house. Rekna refused to be part of the family business world. He even refused the inheritance money that had been prepared for him. His name. He asked for only one thing. A small plot of land on the edge of the village where he wanted to build a free school for orphans. Because I know what it's like to grow up without knowing who you are, Bayu said in a television interview. And I don't want any other child to feel alone like I did. The interview spread across the country. Many people cried, were inspired, and started sending donations to support Bayu's dream. But not everyone is happy. Reza, who saw Bayu getting public love and sympathy, became angry again. He felt defeated not because of the inheritance, but because a small child had taken away something he had been seeking recognition for. Thus began the final step of his plan. He hired men to burn down Mr. Jono's small house, hoping to force Bayu to move to the city. But that night, the plan failed because Bayu was still awake. Writing on a wooden table near the window, he smelled smoke coming out. And seeing the fire starting to spread from behind the kitchen, he immediately woke Mr. Jono and shouted for help. Local residents came. They doused the fire, beat it with wet sacks. And after 2 hours of struggle, the fire was extinguished. Their house was damaged, but no one was injured. Bayu sat on the ground staring at the remaining kitchen charcoal. Her tears fell. But not because of fear, not because of trauma, but because of sadness seeing the world so cruel to people who never asked for anything. Mr. Jono sat next to him. In a low voice she said, "You're not alone. Come on, look, people are helping. You have them and you have me." That day Bayu made a big decision. He would speak in public not to defend himself, but to speak about the truth, about love, loss, and the strength of a child's heart who grew up in the arms of 2 poor farmers but with rich hearts. That morning the sky was gray, clouds hanging low over the house that was still half burned. But in Bayu's chest, there was something burning brightly, courage. He had decided no longer to hide, no longer to just write quietly. Now was the time to speak, not as the grandson of a billionaire, not as the son of a rich woman, but as Bayu, the son of a poor farmer who knew exactly what loss and true affection meant. Ratna, who had initially rejected Bayu's idea to speak on national television, finally nodded, though with anxiety. "Are you sure you're ready?" asked his grandmother quietly. Bayu nodded. "I have to, Grandma. Not for me, but for Dad, for Mrs. Mina, and for everyone who believes goodness still exists." In the afternoon, Bayu sat in a large television studio. In front of the sparkling cameras and dazzling lights, he wore a simple white shirt. No jewelry, no family crest, just a serene smile and clear eyes that hold a story. The interview started with light questions. But Bayu immediately interrupted, asking to speak without a script. "I'm Bayu," he said firmly. "I'm nobody. I'm just a child who was once found under a tree. wrapped in rags by an old farmer and his wife. They took care of me without knowing who I was. They fed me even though they were hungry themselves. They taught me that family isn't about blood, but about who stays when everyone else is gone. He paused for a moment. The entire studio was silent. The world knows I'm the grandson of a billionaire, but to me that title isn't important. What matters is who instilled values in my heart since childhood. I learned that the truth must be fought for. And now I want to talk about something that's been hidden. He then took out a worn notebook. This is my mother's, Mrs. Mina's, notebook. Before she died, she wrote everything about the night I was found, about who first abandoned me. And I want everyone to know, there's someone who's been pretending to care, but is actually the first person I want to lose from this life. The name came out of Bayou's mouth. Everyone was shocked. The crew in the studio stopped moving. The presenter's face tensed. But Bayou continued. Reza was the first person to know about my birth. He knew that Iburethi was pregnant out of wedlock. He knew that my extended family rejected me. And he, who was supposed to protect the family's flesh and blood, was the mastermind behind my exile to the forest. He bribed people to take me far away, thinking I would die there. Suddenly, the news exploded in the media. The internet was filled with comments. Some praised Bayou's courage, others were still skeptical, but it didn't take long for evidence to emerge. A former longtime family driver, Mr. Booty, appeared and testified in the media. I was told to take the baby to the forest at night. I don't know why, but Reza told me to. He said, let this matter be resolved. I don't want any illegitimate child to tarnish the family name. The testimony turned everything upside down. The police started to move. Reza was called in for questioning. He evaded but was eventually caught when he tried to escape abroad. Accusations of child neglect, attempted murder, and falsification of official documents have left him facing a lengthy legal process. Meanwhile, the world embraced Bayou. The free school he designed began to be built from donations that continued to flow. Many famous figures came to help. But Bayou still lives in the small house that he rebuilt with the residents. In that house, he made a reading room for the children. He taught them to read, write, and get to know the world through stories. He named the space, Ibu Mina's Corner. Mr. Jono, even though his health continues to decline, smiles every time he sees the children sitting cross-legged listening to Bayou's stories. Are you already a great person, you? She said one morning. Bayou hugged her. I'm just continuing what you started. And in silence, Mrs. Ratna realized one thing. The love he gave to his grandson, even though it was late, has grown into a tree whose roots reach many hearts. He didn't just save his grandson. He has planted new hope for a generation that wants to grow up without scars. But Bayou's story is not over yet. Because behind all this, one secret still remains. What really happened to Rati, Bayou's biological mother? And why did she disappear without a trace? Since giving birth. The days after Reza's arrest passed in a calmer atmosphere. Bayou's small house began to recover. The villagers not only rebuilt the burned kitchen, but also added a small room at the back of the house. A place where Bayou can write and receive guests. They called that room the Room of Hope. But behind that calm, Bayou continued to think about one thing that had never been answered. Where did Rati, her biological mother, go? Everyone thought Rati was dead. Yes, Ratna herself never talks much. Every time Bayou asked about his mother, the old woman just looked down and said, "He went too far, son. Even for me to be his mother." But Bayou knows that behind that sentence there is a big secret hidden. So one night, Bayou opened Buminua's old wooden cupboard. Inside he found a small iron box that he had never seen before. He opened it with an old key hanging from the bed cover. Inside the box were some old letters. Letters written by Ratty were dated before and after Bayou's birth. In the letters, Ratty tells about her fear of facing a pregnancy without permission, about her guilt for bringing shame to her family, and about the choice she made, leaving everything to save Bayou from the family's shame. But what surprised Bayou the most was the last letter dated a few days after his birth. There Ratty wrote, "If one day you read this, it means you are still alive, son. Forgive me. I left not because I didn't love you, but because the world forced me to choose between my life or yours. And I chose you." Bayou's tears fell one by one onto the paper, but he didn't stop reading. "I'm hiding in a small town called Salira. I work as a nurse in a remote clinic. I don't dare use my real name. But I always pray that one day you will find your mother. Not because of wealth, not because of revenge, but because of love." The name Salira stuck in Bayou's head like lightning. He immediately looked for the town on a small map located in the mountains. Access was limited, but it was still there. The next day he spoke to Mr. Jono and Mrs. "Retna, I want to go to Salira," Bayou said firmly. "I want to find my mother." Ratna could only nod slowly, her eyes filled with tears. "If she's still alive, hug her for my mother." The trip to Salira took 2 days by bus and rental car. Bayou was accompanied by Mr. Jono, who insisted on coming along even though his body was getting weaker. They traveled along narrow roads, through pine forests, along small rivers, and finally arrived at the small town. Salira seemed peaceful, the people were friendly. But when Bayou mentioned Ratia's name, no one knew. Until a small child pointed to an old building on the hillside. If it was the old nurse, maybe Mrs. Sari. She lived in that house. Bayou and Mr. Jono climbed the hill. The house was simple, wooden walls, peeling paint, but the front yard was full of flowers, like a small, carefully tended garden. Bayou knocked for a long time, but there was no answer. Then the door opened. A middle-aged woman came out. Her hair was long and tied back, her eyes sharp but calm. She stared at Bayou for a long time. Then she said, "You're Bayou." The world seemed to stop. Bayou stared at him without blinking. The woman walked slowly closer, stroking Bayou's face with trembling hands. "God is good, you are alive, son. You're alive." Bayou couldn't say anything. He immediately hugged the woman, tightly for a long time, as if he wanted to make up for the long years of loss. Mr. Jono stood a few steps behind. He wiped his tears silently without saying anything, but his smile explained everything. In that small house, Ratty told everything. After giving birth, she was hidden by Reza in a small hospital, then thrown into a remote town so as not to cause problems in the family. She chose to change her identity because she felt she had no hope of returning. But every day she prayed that her child would grow up in the arms of a good person. And it turned out my prayers were answered, he said while looking at Mr. Jono. That day was a new day for Bayou. He not only found his mother, but also rediscovered a part of himself that had been lost. The wound on his chest slowly healed. The next day they returned to the village. Ratty came home with me. The residents welcomed him warmly. Yes, Ratna cried when she saw her daughter. They hugged for a long time, realizing that they had lost too much time, but were still given the chance to start again. And that night, for the first time in his life, Bayou slept without nightmares. Because finally all the scattered parts of his life have now come back together. 2 months after Ratia's return to the village, Bayou's life changed slowly, but profoundly. Their small house is no longer just a place to live, but has become the center of village social activities. The children come every afternoon, sitting cross-legged on mats, listening to the stories read by Bayu and his mother. Ratty, who once lived in fear and loneliness, has now rediscovered her true self. She returned to being a nurse not in a luxury clinic, but in the homes of people in need. He walked from one hamlet to another, carrying a medicine box and a reassuring smile. People call her Burati, Mother of Hope. Mr. Jono is getting weaker, but he always smiles. He sat on a wooden chair on the porch, watching the children play and listening to the laughter that filled the air every day. One morning he said to Bayu, "Life is like planting a tree. You won't get to see it grow, but you will be the one who will be sheltered by its leaves." Bayu just lowered his head, holding Mr. Jono's hand tightly. He knew that time would not be long. And sure enough, one quiet morning, Mr. Jono breathed his last on the wooden bench where he usually sat. The village mourned. The children lost their grandfather who always smiled. Bayu lost his father, the only person who never left him under any circumstances. The funeral was simple but full of emotion. Bayu stood in front of his father's grave, reading a poem he had written himself. "Father, I am nothing, but because of you I feel enough. You taught me the meaning of home, the meaning of love, the meaning of courage. I promise that I will not keep your legacy in the cupboard, but I will share it, so that all the children in the world can feel what I feel. Thank you, Father." The days after Mr. Jono's departure felt lonely, but Bayu did not drown in sadness. He actually became more active in building his dreams. Together Mrs. Ratna and Ratty, he expanded the learning space into a small school called Rumah Mina Jono. The building stands on land donated by the village government and donations from the community who believed in Bayu's story. The school is more than just a place of learning. There, orphaned and poor children receive education, food, and most importantly, love. Every wall is decorated with quotes from Bayu's writings. Each room is named after an important figure in his life. Mina's class, Jono's class, and Ratia's library. Meanwhile, Reza's legal case ended with an 8-year prison sentence. In an interview from behind bars, Reza said, "I thought I had everything, but I lost to a child who only had love." Bayu didn't retaliate. He didn't want to live in resentment. For him, this story was long enough. All he took with him was the lesson that nothing is stronger than sincere love. That goodness will find its way even through the wilderness and the fires of slander. Ratna, who now lives in a simple house near the school, feels more alive than ever. She often sits in the small garden reading stories to the children. In her heart, she knows that she not only did she rediscover her grandson, but she also rediscovered herself. Not as the heir to a company, but as the grandmother of a generation that heals the world's wounds. On a cool night, as the village breeze gently rustles the leaves, Bayu sits on the porch. She writes in the worn notebook she's kept since childhood. But now her notebook is different. The pages are no longer blank. They're filled with stories that shaped her. "I used to think I was just a child found under a tree, but it turns out I'm the root of a big tree. And my job now isn't to become rich, but to provide shade for anyone tired on the road." Her voice is soft, but her words are powerful. As the stars begin to appear in the sky, Bayu closes her notebook. She looks up at the sky and smiles. "I'm no longer an orphan because I have the love of all those who have saved me. And I promise I will be a home for all lost hearts." Bayu's story is over. But that tale of love, hope, and courage will live on in every child who learns, in every smile that blooms from affection, and in every heart that knows that family isn't about blood, but about who survives. This story is a story fiction written by real people. Not to deceive, but to touch hearts and convey deep wisdom. From Bayu's story, we learn that there is nothing greater than sincere love and selfless sacrifice. We are invited to see that family is not just blood relations, but about who remains, cares for, and loves us when the world turns its back on us. That true treasure is not in material inheritance, but in the legacy of values, love, and kindness. In a world that is often harsh and cruel, this story is a reminder that hope can grow from pain and that even an orphan can be a light for many. Thank you for watching and absorbing this story until the end. If this story touches your heart, please leave a comment, click like, and subscribe so we can continue to present meaningful stories like this to accompany your days.